So the last panel of the day is called More or Less Free, Journalism and the Internet. Emily Bell will be the moderator. Emily is the founding director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. Before that, she had a host of accomplishments, all related under the umbrella of being editor-in-chief of The Guardian and of The Guardian media digital content. I'm going to let Emily introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Link. Good afternoon. So you will have noticed that one of us is not Lydia Polgreen. Lydia sent her intense apologies, but she was sidelined by strep throat but 2 hours ago. So we're actually both simultaneously sorry she's not here, but also sort of glad as well. Saving journalists, or saving me in a very real sense, we have Joel Simon joining the panel this afternoon, who is the chair of the CPJ, who actually fits very nicely into the theme of discussion. Next to Joel, we have Nicholas Lemann, who is Dean Emeritus at the Journalism School and a professor there, and also an author and writer and editor at The New Yorker. And next to him, we have Mike Oreskes. And Mike has already been on a panel in Washington this morning. And Mike is the, better get this right, Senior Vice President of News and Editorial Director at NPR, having run the AP, actually, for a number of years. So I know it's not completely balanced in gender terms, but gender is just a societal construct. So exactly. As you know, it would be rude to comment on it. So we started sort of thinking about this panel as, has the internet made journalism better or worse? Is it better for free expression? Is it worse for free expression? And I thought that we would probably end up being the most pessimistic panel of the day, but actually I think having sat through the rest of it, we're probably going to be the most optimistic by some way. But I just wanted to start by, I'll start with you, Nick, just sort of giving, if each of you could give sort of 2 or 3 minutes on your perspective of this provocation, that, is journalism in a better or a worse place as a result of the internet?
Okay, so I'll just go really fast to stay within 2 to 3 minutes. The big kind of existential question here is, how important is Donald Trump to the answer of the question? We're in an extraordinary moment where a sitting president of the United States, I think for the first time ever, name checks specific news organizations constantly and attacks them and says that they're enemies of the people and predicts that they'll go out of business, calls for changes in the libel laws, etc. Now, per what Arya was saying, if this was happening anywhere else in the world, you'd say, okay, that's the big story here. The president is going after the press. On the other hand, it's, at this moment, all the people Donald Trump yells at publicly are doing better, both journalistically and economically, than they were before he started going after them. And at this moment, he's not, directly going after journalists. So, it kind of like, Arya, why did your family wait till 1939 to leave Germany? Were they lulled into false peace? That's a separate question and perhaps an unfair analogy, but I just don't know, to be honest, how seriously to take President Trump's rhetoric. Let me then put it aside for a minute, because it's so much the obvious problem, and say, there's a difference between free speech, free expression, and the kind of professionalized practice of journalism that all of us up here and many of you in the audience are engaged in. It's easy to say the two are inextricably entwined. What's good for free expression and free speech is also good for journalism. Well, we found out in the last 10 or 15 years that's not actually true. So to me, the big story about journalism is not Donald Trump. It's that our field of endeavor has lost pretty close to half of its employees, editorial employees, in a very short period of time. I don't think that's happened in any other field I know of, including, steel workers and people like that who get more attention. So those disappeared journalists are not the people who used to cover the White House and no longer cover the White House. The coverage of the White House by the best news outlets is glorious right now, I think. These are the people who used to cover state houses, city halls, etc. There's a lot of journalism that used to happen that isn't happening anymore. It's not happening because of state repression, this tragedy. It's happening because of changing economic circumstances, which I'll talk about later if anybody wants details. But basically, the internet cut the legs out from under the business model, particularly of metro newspapers, which were doing most of the original reporting work in American journalism. So that's a threat to journalism practice, but it's not a threat in the sense that we think of the word threat. Government decided to take out journalists because they were misbehaving and did it. It's much more about how the internet economy evolved, and it's a conversation I hope we can have more up here. But I want to say one other thing before I stop. My new social scientist friends in the university talk about the denominator problem, by which they mean the numerator is what you've been hearing about all day, all the different problems that exist in journalism. The denominator is compared to what? Journalism, first of all, wasn't always fabulous in the United States. In the 19th century, it was very heavily partisan, and much of the 19th century, it was financed by political parties, so it was like all Fox News all the time. So don't think that's new. And then, in the 1920s, late 19th century, early 20th century, you had the clickbait of the day, lots of sensational news about murders and so on. Columbia turned down Joseph Pulitzer's gift for more than 10 years to start the journalism school and the Pulitzer Prizes because he was seen as so distasteful in his chasing public audiences relentlessly. And then I'm old enough to remember the good old days as a young man, and a lot of us didn't think the good old days were that good. We didn't sit around and say, isn't it wonderful that people can only get their news from Walter Cronkite and they can't talk back and so on. So I think we have to have a whole conversation about what about journalism that isn't free speech is necessary for the public good, and then how do we provide it? And I hope we can start that today and do it for many years at the Knight Institute.
Terrific. So Mike, your public media, which actually probably feels as though you are under direct threat from the current administration, given the pronouncements or executive orders about funding and how public media is viewed. What's your perspective?
Yeah, so I found myself in violent agreement with the Dean. Here's the way I think you can look at it, starting with the question. So there have been waves of events that have affected journalism since the 20 or 25 years that we've had internet, digital. And the first wave basically demolished the business model of newspapers. And it's really important to keep that piece in mind here, because in fact, there's been a lot of additions to journalism in the 20 years, and particularly in the last 5 years, at digital companies, not-for-profit companies, and in what you would call public media. There have been 500 journalists alone added in public radio, almost all of them in local. And I think what Nick said actually is the crucial point. We're going to have to mention the framers, right? We can't have this conversation. So the whole concept of American liberty was based on the idea that there'd be levels of power. And one of those levels that's been extremely effective in this country has been local, not just local governments, but also local journalism. And it really has been the driving and defining element of American journalism. And in fact, it's the part of journalism that Ronald Reagan so wonderfully defended when he was in Moscow at the State University, and he had all those kids there, and he explained to them how there were umpteen hundred television stations and so many more radio stations and even more newspapers, and every one of them was an individually owned, individually run organization that made its own decisions about journalism. And he was right.
But there was
And
one thing he left out.
let me finish. So what's been damaged badly are those local newspapers. The local radio stations have actually improved considerably in this same period, and I think have a lot of the new model in them, the new model of subscription-driven or publicly supported, and by public I don't mean government per se, I mean the public, which might include taxpayer money. And there's clearly a model developing that is already a key part of the solution. There's a group in the Ohio Valley, which is the quintessential coal mining area that everybody claims we aren't covering well enough. In fact, there are these 8 journalists in the Ohio Valley working for a group called the Ohio Valley Resource Group, which was funded, in fact, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And they've done a fantastic job working with NPR and with others to capture the difficulties of coal miners, and not just miners, but of the people in some of the poorest counties in this country. They don't work for newspapers anymore. They work in digital and other kinds of distribution. This isn't to say we didn't have big problems. There hasn't been enormous disruption or huge damage. But I think, to Nick's point, it's time to start talking about the forward-looking question. So I'm in my own disagreement, I'm agreeing, which is that we can go forward now. There's clearly some solutions out there. There are clearly things to be done, and we have to just let go of the way we've thought about this and start thinking about it in some new ways. Because once you rebuild that local level of journalism, that's where you rebuild everything. That's where you rebuild trust. That's where you rebuild credibility. That's where you bring people divided by all sorts of partisan gaps back together. You cannot do that at the national level. You cannot do it at the level of these new digital organizations. You certainly can't do it at the national level of cable television. Their business models really push hard against it. But I think you can do it in a local setting where people's issues and interests are much more driven by specific issues rather than partisan outcomes.
So Joel, we took this, not surprisingly for a First Amendment centre in a discussion about sort of the role of the First Amendment. This has been it's been very focused on America. Yeah. But we're talking about actors now that take journalism and free speech into the rest of the world, sort of outside the usual nation-state boundaries, and they run up against the journalists that you're busy working with and protecting in the rest of the world. What's the future piece looking like there?
Well, let me just start by sort of talking about one thing that the internet has a way in which it's transformed the entire media ecosystem, which is that it's global, right? I mean, there's a connection between the information that journalists report on in this country and the information that people have access to around the world, and that system flows towards us as well. We have a system in which we depend very directly on local journalists working in dangerous and repressive environments who share information, utilize these systems to share information, and so that we have a sort of common interest in defending this system. So then that's positive. I mean, that's not only positive, it's transformative. It's unprecedented. It's something that seemed almost impossible, even a few decades ago. But then you take a step back and you look at the data, and that's kind of CPJ's specialty, and you look at, we have this information landscape that's been absolutely transformed by technology, which has put information at people's fingertips and allowed journalists in one part of the world to inform people everywhere, and yet, more journalists are being imprisoned around the world than we've ever seen. Last year, there were we do an annual census of journalists in prison around the world. It goes back to 1992. Last year was a record number, 259 journalists around the world. That's the highest number we've ever documented. And last year, we had a slightly lower rate of journalists killed around the world, but if you look at the last 5 years, certainly, you're seeing, again, record numbers. So if you look at that, and then you have things that, we can sort of debate, how effective they are at measuring the state of global press freedom, but Reporters Without Borders just came out with its index on press freedom. You have Freedom House, which does an annual index, and the trends that they're showing are negative trends. Less press freedom, less freedom for journalists globally, less freedom in democratic countries. That correlates with this whole period of technological transformation, and so we have to very much acknowledge that fact as well.
And I think one thing that's important to say to tie together what Nick started with is the president's entitled to yell at anybody he wants. And in fact, his First Amendment right to yell at me is as big as anybody else's. And most of the damage that that's doing, as unpleasant as it may be to some of us in journalism in this country, the most serious damage he's doing is to the standing of the idea of free expression and free press around the rest of the world.
Well, and that's what Aryeh made. And let's remember that Aryeh talked about the visit with Sisi, who said is doing a fantastic job. He's doing a fantastic job of jailing journalists. There are 25 journalists in prison in Egypt. He met with President Xi of China. That's the second leading jailer of journalists. He's congratulated Erdogan. He's the leading jailer of journalists. So that's an absolute incontrovertible.
And the reality is when the President of the United States demeans and belittles journalism, it allows others, it empowers others to take even more serious action. And that's deeply problematic.
So just returning to that, because sort of picking up on that theme of things that sort of we're concerned about here, which play very differently in the rest of the world, we'll come back to the kind of the key economic questions in a minute. But this issue again of, if you like, sort of bad speech driving out good. So if we look at the other things which are actually going on in the ecosystem, the idea, Tim Wu framed it this morning as being, it's kind of like what we pay attention to, and the sort of the live rail of somebody was saying that you have to have Donald Trump in a story now to actually get it kind of read, or unless you're the guy with the toddler running into the back of his sort of 2A, that the attention market has completely changed. What's the kind of Mike as an editor, what's the answer to that? Is it a problem? Is that an overstated problem?
It's overstated. It's not true that the only thing that anybody, certainly we look at our own numbers and we see obviously stories about Trump and stories about the government are getting a lot of attention these days, which is not altogether a bad thing. But we also see people coming in the door and then being interested in other things as well. So I do think there's been a rising interest in news and in journalism in general, which I think is a positive thing. And we're seeing a lot of interest in other topics, frankly. So I'm not sure. I think it's overstated. I do think the challenge for journalism right now is not to take the interest in the president right now and the presidency and the government and these issues and to use it responsibly. You can use that interest to run up your own score, to run up your own income or your own ratings, or you can use it to try to make a more informed country. And that's a choice we make. That's not a choice the president makes.
Right, Nick.
This is not a new problem. This is an eternal and old problem. And I just think I was a little worried about Tim framing it as a new problem. And I think he's doing it partly because he was so starry-eyed about the internet in the first instance. If you go back and read, let's say, Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, 1922, total despair over, the journalistic audience's ability to pay attention to what's important. So, I think here, I'm sorry, but the answer is in plain sight, and it's not covered by the phrase new business models completely. It's no accident that all four of us on the stage work for not-for-profit institutions. There is no shame in that. If you look around in our society and say, gee, is there any such thing as a socially valuable institution that can't survive out on the cold wind prairie of the free market and needs a little help, even though it still tries to attract an audience and so on? The answer is yes, there's a zillion of them, including Columbia University. So we already have a toolkit for how to preserve, things that have value, that require some kind of peer review or professionalization system, that require a little extra support, that need a little protective harbor from the marketplace while they still have an incentive to try to attract an audience. And it's all over the world of academe, culture, think tanks, et cetera. So there's this very, very rich set of models. Already, some of the good news in journalism is the growth in the not-for-profit sector just in the last few years. So I just don't like the framing of either those dumb people who like to read bad stuff have to improve themselves and learn to read good stuff, or let's yell at Facebook and make them fix the problem, or let's invent a new business model for journalism and that'll fix the problem. There's a lot of other tools in the toolkit.
I agree. Can we yell at Facebook later, though? I mean, can we come back to that part? Because I don't want to give up on
that.
that.
Emily do
But
I was very much hoping we would be yelling.
Yeah,
We can yell at Facebook,
but just to illustrate Nick's point in my real world. So it often surprises people when I explain that the total budget of public radio in the United States is about $1 billion, of which less than 100 million, probably about $97, $98 million, is actually federal money.
Right.
So in other words, 10 cents on the dollar is the federal government.
How much did that one bomb that fell on Afghanistan cost?
I don't know. It costs us a lot just
More.
to cover it, right? But so the point being, that's not insignificant. It's not nothing. It has a value. And by the way, the proportion is much higher for small stations in rural areas. But what Nick is saying is really true. It's a primer. It's a helping hand that allows us to operate differently from a purely commercial operation. And a big part of the difference is I actually worry how many people listen to us. I worry how many people read us, but I don't have to worry whether they're between the ages of 25 and 54. I don't have to worry whether they're in key metropolitan communities. I can spend time trying to reach people in inner cities, poor neighborhoods, rural counties. And that's what that 10% allows, is that kind of different way of thinking.
On this issue of shouting at Facebook, which I do want to return
Yes, please.
to, Joel, kind of, again, these organisations have, arguably sort of done more to get the word out in parts of the world where it was just very difficult to maintain your own infrastructure for publishing, etc. And yet, they also have this amazing, again, Zainab was saying it this morning, like the centralization of that power feels wrong. Somehow, to all of us as journalists, it feels wrong. What's the kind of, is there a way that we should be working as, professional journalists with platforms? How do we should we resist using them? Many of the people who, you deal with have no alternative.
I mean, resisting using Facebook is like, I don't know, boycotting Walmart or something. I mean, it's just, I don't think that's I mean, on a personal level, you may not find it useful or what have you, but I don't think that has any impact on policy. Yes, I mean, obviously, this is a, Facebook, Twitter and Google are part of this global infrastructure that I described, and they have tremendous power in terms of determining what information we have access to, how we access it, how news organizations function, and they resisted, as we know, for a period of time, sort of engaging in that discussion and bringing in the news organizations and I think on the economic model there was even greater resistance. I mean, I think that was not successful, but I'm starting to see more engagement around the issue of creating a kind of mechanism whereby diverse views are not diverse, but whereby external actors that seek to use these platforms to influence global public opinion, creating an infrastructure to address that. And so we're starting to see some of that, and of course that's positive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's actually a true choice.
Right.
But I would actually lean in the direction that I think you and others have been leading us, which is we have to engage these big platform companies, but we have to engage them with a clear picture, not just of commercial interests or even our audience interests, but of the public and civic responsibility interests. In other words, the simple question of how does Facebook's algorithms work? You know, it's a profoundly important question. And it's, by the way, a good subject for journalism.
Right.
So I think one of our roles is as executives to engage them at an executive level on how do you deal with our company. But another role, which we've taken very seriously at NPR and we have people assigned to, is cover them. These are companies. Yeah. They do things for company reasons. And that should be explored. And transparency remains an important tool.
Right. It's still sort of amazing to me that nobody has created, unless I'm wrong, somebody can correct me on this, nobody's really created a beat which is Google in the same way that sort of you have a beat which is the White House or which is government.
Well, we actually do have a reporter in Silicon Valley named Atish Shahani, whose beat is essentially Facebook, more than Google, but both. I mean, both.
Right.
And, you know, we see that as one of the big societal issues right now.
Right.
How these platforms operate, how they make their decisions, what their actual interests are.
But just, I mean, let's go. I mean, just to, I think that's obviously important. But let's go back to Trump and his use of Twitter. Okay. So the standard narrative is that Trump is using the media to bypass. I mean, using Twitter to bypass the media. But that's not the case at all. What he's using Twitter to do is create a news story that the media has. He has many. You know, Obama to a certain extent bypassed the media and use social media to do that. Trump is seeking to activate the media and make news by using Twitter. So the relationship between Trump's use of social media is much, and like the media itself is much more conventional. And Trump has obviously empowered the traditional media because he watches it all day long. You know, he engages with it even as he disparages it. So that's actually to go to Nick's point. You know, a lot of people start to reframe this relationship, but in many ways it's very conventional.
Right. Sorry, Nick, you were going to make a point there.
A few things just about how this is framed. I mean, first of all, just stating the obvious. These are the private companies. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Facebook or Google, but I mean, you can complain like about the White House press room. When you go to a meeting at Facebook or Google with anybody, the first thing you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement at the receptionist's desk. You know, these are not companies that are themselves operating on principles of transparency about themselves. They believe information should be free, but they don't include their algorithms in that. Mm-hmm. And you know, stating the obvious, getting back to some of the earlier discussion, all these big platforms ban hate speech, okay? So they're the dominant way the world talks to itself and people talk to each other, becoming ever more dominant. Yes, there's still an open web, but, you know, and when hate speech is found on Google, the press says, oh my God, they let it slip through. We've got to crack down on hate speech on Google. So we've already canted the argument in this way that says we're against hate speech now for the dignity type reason, I suppose, that Aryeh gave. And nobody's saying, but what about free speech on these platforms? The other thing is, you know, our national conversation has gone so far in the direction over 50 years of immense respect for companies and the marketplace and immense distrust and fear of government that I think it's just gone too far. 100 years ago, the conversation was about the excessive power of the railroad companies and United States Steel and Standard Oil. So did people say, somebody's got to talk to Mr. Carnegie and Mr. Morgan and Mr. Rockefeller and just ask them to behave better as a matter of public responsibility? No. There were arguments about how to do it, but basically, you know, government entered the picture and a new social order emerged in stages, and it was messy, but that's what happened. You know, I think that will happen in this instance, but it's frustrating that we're not talking about that now.
Well, of course, government entered the picture after various muckrakers and other journalists exposed all sorts of abuses which drew their attention. So I think there's a very big parallel. You know, we did something recently that I will completely confess was an effort to juxtapose something that we thought was the right way to do things versus the way the big platforms do. We use algorithms, as almost every media company does these days. The most important one we use actually is for an app we call NPR One, which selects things from our various offerings of the day and delivers them to you on your mobile phone or wherever you get it. Thanks to the Knight Foundation for their support for it. And we use an algorithm to help sort the material. But we do some things in this algorithm because we're editors. We couldn't stop ourselves from being editors, even if we wanted to. So for example, in this algorithm, if we think there's a story you have to have, we don't care what your 50 choices have been. We make you listen to the story anyway. If you want to turn it off, you can turn it off. We make you listen to the newscast. And we do things that we think further the journalism as opposed to just making the perfect bubble for you. So we wrote a long explanation in layman's language, not in code, to try to explain how we do this. And I think that if all of us in media start doing that and really take that aggressively, even though none of us are as big as Facebook or Google on our own, as a set of players in society, we're pretty big.
So it's modeling best practice type thing.
Yep.
But coming back to that sort of issue of transparency, and Nick, you touched on, at some point the government enters the scene. Joel, again, kind of like this brings us into this question of everybody now has a view about how to stop fake news, quote unquote, or how to, I notice my own government in Britain, which always makes me proud in terms of how far-sighted and brilliant it is on media regulation. That's irony, that's British irony. Said this morning, we must fine every time we see hate speech on Google or Facebook, we're going to fine them, whatever it is, $500,000 or so. And the German government has been sort of very much sort of looking at the same sorts of things. What does it look like to have effective regulatory intervention? Is that something the CPJ actually wants? Because we feel incredibly queasy here in the States about any level of regulation or regulatory oversight.
Well, the starting point for any, sort of regulatory oversight is a government that is accountable and that's seeking to use that oversight authority to serve the public interest. And that is not something you would assume that exists in many countries around the world where governments make this kind of critique against the media and use that critique to justify their own engagement. So it's a very slippery slope. I absolutely think that Nick's point, if you're looking at it in a U.S. context, there's definitely a valid argument. Is it time to start thinking about ways in which governments can intervene to shape this landscape? But if you take that same argument and you apply it to Turkey, or you apply it to China, where the government is actively intervening and shaping that landscape in ways that serve its interests, and actually doing so quite effectively, that's not a model that I think we at the Committee to Protect Journalists want to suggest is appropriate on a global scale.
Nick, what about you? You were saying, what might it look like? Not necessarily endorse it.
First of all, go back to Mike's anecdote about Ronald Reagan describing the distributed media system. Well, why did that exist? Because it was regulated. And guess who deregulated it? Ronald Reagan. When people hear government, especially with respect to the press or speech, they tend to go automatically to the chief executive will personally decide everything based on what's good for him or her. And so, it's very, very important to understand a distinction I first heard from Aryeh, which is between state media and public media. There are a lot of, I'm personally for fake news in the sense of, I do think it's a free speech problem to try to suppress fake news. So my cause would be more try to find ways to replace the disappeared economic support system around real news rather than try to prevent there from being fake news. As I was saying before, there's lots and lots of ways to do that through, creating several layers of protection from sitting politicians, peer review systems, et cetera. It happens a lot. I know it doesn't happen as reliably in much of the world where the constitutional systems and balance of power are not as robust. But here it happens a lot in many fields, including things like NPR. And so that's the kind of conversation I think we should have. There's also, you know, a long-standing tradition that kind of waxes and wanes of just distributing concentrations of economic, political, and social power because we believe in having a more decentralized country. And that tradition has been sort of lying dormant for a long time, but it's a rich American tradition going way back to the founding, and some of that could be revived as well. I can get more specific if you want, but you know, that's a sort of general frame.
But this sort of redistributive model is so completely against what we've actually seen happening in the market in the last 2 years.
But there's a reason for that, which is, and you know, you're seeing it again in the Trump administration. There's a feeling that as concentrated as everything has already gotten, let's make things even more concentrated. I mean, at this point we have, you know, 5 banks control 50% of the banking assets in the country, which would have been unthinkable for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. 5 relatively new internet companies have the most market cap in the Dow. Virtually every field sort of errs to the side of super concentration, and you're seeing in this country concentrations of wealth, concentrations by geography. It's a, you know, as our former vice president used to say, it's a big effing deal. And a lot of the sort of populist energy you're seeing in the country is because of that.
Yeah. It's helpful a little bit to think about, to separate out a couple of the problems. So, you know, one problem, which Nick described quite well earlier, is the destruction of a lot of journalism. Just about the creation of the material, frankly, the shoe leather reporting. Right. And we have to rebuild that. That's a very important task. That's not the same task as how are we going to distribute it? How will we make sure the people who want it get it? They're related, obviously, but in the past they were related by the business model.
Right.
And that's not inherently the case. It doesn't have to be the case, or there could be a business model over here and a business model over here. So, and I think when you put it all together, it gets so complicated, it kind of begins to drown out all of it. It's really important. The first thing is, if you start creating good journalism, there will be people who will want it. And that already is clearly true. I mean, people don't give us money just because we give them coffee cups. I mean, the mugs are really nice, but they actually...
Or the tote bag.
Yeah, the tote bag.
Which actually
Did you want a tote bag?
Well, that is why I do give you money. But
What about the umbrellas?
Right.
That's in wait,
I
don't
guess
tell
for
me.
you guys, it wasn't you. But anyway, the point is there clearly are many people who want decent journalism, and they are giving money to various groups. I'm not even sure that in the long run that in itself is a full sustainable model, but the point is we can build a much more civically focused, audience-based creation of journalism that solves half the problem. Now, the other half of the problem is how do we make sure we reach the broad public?
Right.
How do we get them re-engaged? How do we get to them when they're mainly tied up in these platforms that don't necessarily have a business interest in helping with this? That's a separate problem. So it helps to separate and see them that way.
But you were talking about the lack of reporting at a local level, and we did a kind of an event with the Town Center in San Francisco 3 or 4 weeks ago, where Joaquin Alvarado, who runs the Center for Investigative Reporting, he was saying, you know, this is not $1 billion problem, or, you know, to put a decent reporting teams in every state house. It's like maybe $100 or $200 million problem. Right. But it is the fact that the scale that is required to have a sustainable model funded by advertising on, you know, technology platforms or in the market of technology platforms simply does not work at local level. And for similar reasons of scale, actually subscription has not worked well either, and there's a question whether you would even want subscription to work at a local level. In other words, you know, you have to reach those people who are not engaged. So what is the answer?
Here's an answer. In 2009, we published a report at the journalism school by Len Downey, ex-editor of the Washington Post, and Michael Shudson of our faculty, with a bunch of recommendations, and one of them was something they called the Fund for Local News. And we really designed it to look a little bit like the National Science Foundation or National Institutes of Health. There'd be a quite modest fund distributed at the state level by the federal government, and a jury would be impaneled. And anybody could apply for the funds. You'd go in and you'd say, I want to cover the hospital system for 3 years or 5 years. You could be a startup, you could be the local newspaper, you could be the NPR affiliate. You just say, here's what I'm going to deliver on, and then choose among the applicants, make a round of grants, and then you'd come back after 3 years or 5 years and say, okay, we delivered or we didn't deliver, and part of the delivery would be what audience did you attract. And then you could be renewed. So, I thought this was pretty innocuous. We had a launch event for this report. We got 100% negative reaction to this from journalists, saying you're calling for state control of the media. You were there, remember, Arya? And there was this great moment when, at this event at the New York Public Library, Jeff Jarvis got up and he said, you are calling for state control of the media. And I said, wait a minute, Jeff, you are a government employee and nobody's shutting you up, so how come they would shut these people up? And he said, well, I have tenure, But anyway, it's just, to me, it's weird how everybody we know kind of lives within these webs of rules, but assumes that in the case of professionalized journalism, which has costs associated with it, which has a clear social benefit, which the market economy is not providing, which Facebook and Google have ignored many entreaties to go into and produce themselves, that anything like what I just proposed, maybe that's just to start the conversation, is, as my little sister used to say, anathema, and you cannot discuss it.
Right.
So that I find frustrating.
Do you sense, though, this is sort of for the whole panel, that there is actually a sort of a sea change in that? So again, kind of like when I got here 7 years ago, people were really horrified at the idea that the free market, wouldn't provide great journalism. I came from the land of the BBC, where it's natural that actually all the terrible journalism is provided by the free market, and all the good journalism is provided by the license fee, and the Guardian, which I worked for. So, but that sort of, does it feel as though there has been a sea change? We've had a sea change in terms of people wanting to.
Can we have a stream change or a trickle change instead of a whole sea change?
Kind of a coastal swell change kind of thing. So I think there's actually been two changes. The first is that I'd say over the last 10 years or so, the idea that the ad model is actually dead has finally sunk in on everybody.
Right.
I mean, there was the first wave of the digital age when everybody was trying to recreate the advertising model in a digital setting. I think everybody sort of accepted that. So now they're all trying to build essentially the public radio model, which is some version of a subscription subscription membership model. That's great, welcome. I think, and that's good. And then I do think that has also changed the attitude about public financing. So you now see major commercial organizations, major newspapers, looking for both foundation and government grant money.
Right.
And so that's, I don't know if that's a sea change or it's certainly a change. In many ways, I think the move towards a much more audience-based support, however, is actually a bigger element of change than the willingness to let the government have some piece in it. I still don't think this is a country that would ever accept the scale of government ownership, if that's the right word for it, that the BBC. I was actually just the other day up at a conversation in Toronto with the head of news at the CBC and the head of news at the BBC and myself, and it was really quite striking, the range from the extraordinary level of support that the BBC gets from a dedicated tax. Well, not to call it a tax, a fee.
It's a license fee.
It's a tax.
It gets it because you.
If it quacks like a tax, and how does that go?
Also, if you go to prison if you don't pay it.
That's a tax. Okay, anyway.
They've got rid of that clause now.
So they get that. The CBC gets less than half that volume of money in a smaller country, I don't know, per capita. But per capita they get less, and obviously we get far less, although all three of us have a dependency on government financing. So I don't think this country would ever accept a BBC model, nor do I think it's necessary, frankly. We don't need that level of support to have a robust journalistic network.
But just on this, so I'm going to come to questions in the audience, so if you have one, stick your hand in the air. But just sort of mentioning things like the BBC, CBC, etc., and NPR, when we're talking about, we seem to be talking about a landscape at the moment where the functions of publishing, this is a paper that we put out at the Town Centre a couple of weeks ago called the Platform Press, where we're saying basically the functions of publishing have moved up a level, and they are now being overtaken, they have been taken over by large-scale platforms, and the potential kind of arc for that is that publishing as a category of activity for organizations that employ journalists goes away or ceases to be a sort of a viable way of making money. You know, so in other words, you have the prospect of weakened institutions. You have these incredibly powerful, wealthy platforms for publishing, which really encourage individuals and flatten the kind of corporate brand. If we're going into that world, do we not want very strong institutions to protect press freedom and stand outside the system, which is also used by the surveillance state?
By institutions, do you mean journalistic institutions? Yeah, I think absolutely we do, and it's very important. I mean, I think we're in an interesting moment because we still have a number of journalistic institutions that are, while very engaged with these platforms, still have their own levels of independence. So, I mean, NPR is only one of a number of examples, but so NPR has a total audience every week of about 80 million people. Half of that audience, thereabout, is still on the radio, a platform we have total control over. The platform companies don't have any influence over that at this moment. Another part of that audience is on digital devices streaming the audio, either audio that was originally created for the radio or just audio we create for streaming. And while we sometimes get help from the platforms in directing audience, most of our audience does not come from the platforms. And then we have a more traditional, I can't believe I'm talking about the kind of digital audience that others are familiar on, where I'd say a little over half our audience on npr.org comes directly from Facebook, and another 25% comes from Google. So that platform is very dependent, obviously. So we have a range of ways of reaching people, some of which are highly dependent on these platforms and some of which aren't dependent at all. And that's given us a certain amount, for the moment, of ability to have a conversation without worrying that our business will just be shut down if they don't like what we say.
Right.
So
You go ahead, and then
a couple quick thoughts on this. First of all, in terms of the sea change or maybe, pond change.
Pond change,
10 years ago, when you'd be in a meeting like this, there'd always be somebody there who would say, essentially, if there were no journalists at all, the public would be better informed because the journalists function to suppress information, not create information. There was a tremendous faith in crowdsourcing and participatory journalism. And so there really has been a change due to having a natural experiment in this, where even people like our friend Clay Shirky will say, yes, you need journalists. Yes, they have to have jobs. Yes, they have to work in organizations. So the problem is, we're seeing on the internet that the person who reads the New York Times is decreasingly saying, oh, I'm going to read the New York Times, so I'll go to the New York Times webpage. They're encountering disembodied articles on Facebook. So you have to deal with the problem of how to preserve organizations when the audience the social good inheres in organizations, but the audience, with exceptions like NPR, doesn't make the connection to the organization. Right. I mean, I had some of you may remember, if we go back 20 years, Mike Kinsley wrote an article in the New Yorker about what the internet was going to mean for journalism. He said, isn't it wonderful, we can just publish our content and get rid of the bother of distribution, all those printing presses and delivery trucks. And since everybody loves us for our content, we'll make more money and have lower costs. Well, then it turns out, some of you may have encountered Professor Bruce Greenwald at Columbia Business School. Is that a familiar name? Right after I came here 14 years ago, I went to a lecture by him, and he said, in the media business, 100% of the value is in distribution and 0% of the value is in content. And I thought, uh-oh. But, subsequent events have shown that he was right. Mm-hmm. So yes, on the institutions and organizations, but it's a complicated problem because the the platforms have attracted the audience.
Right, yeah. Joe.
Yeah, and I just keep plugging what we're talking about into this global information ecosystem, which is it's just the way I always see it, the way in which the media in this country relates to the media in the UK, or relates to the media throughout Europe, or relates to the global media. And so my question is, are the models and structures we're talking about is it going to be possible to replicate them in societies where the government or violent forces, for that matter, exercise power and control over the information that people have access to? So what I find is, you have effective, to make the distinction between public and state media, virtually every country has state media. Only a handful of countries have truly effective, independent public media. That's a relative rarity. Most countries, in addition to state media, have some market-driven or some quasi-market-driven media. They're confronting many of the same challenges that we're describing here, although in many instances it's maybe 10 years behind. But if we look at the data that CPJ, the attacks on journalists, which usually are carried out in efforts to censor certain kinds of information, those tend to be perpetrated against media that's privately owned, despite its imperfections and despite the fact that it may be more politicized. And so, you have relatively small instances of sort of philanthropic institutions financing media in the developing world. There's some wonderful experiments in El Faro, for example, in El Salvador, but it's a relative rarity. And so that's the thing that I would always keep in mind. How does this discussion fit into this global landscape, and are the kinds of solutions and approaches that we're talking about here scalable in the rest of the world?
And this is both important, and it's important in the United States to realize that the United States, both as a country, as a government, and as a people, have a huge interest in the success of these journalists in the rest of the world, because, as Joel's own data shows, most of the threats against journalists, most of the killings of journalists are not of the swashbuckling foreign correspondent who we envision, but actually of local journalists working in these countries, and they are the main source of information that we have about the rest of the world. Sometimes directly from them, sometimes through a Western correspondent who's working there. When David Gilkey was killed on a road in Helmand Province last year, he was with Zabihullah Tamana, who was a very well-known and competent Afghani journalist, who in fact was as much a source of information for us at NPR as David himself. And the repression in these other countries is actually cutting off our understanding of the rest of the world. And that's a very serious problem.
Right. I'm going to go to the audience for questions. We've got one over there, one there, one there, and one there. So if we start there, on the far side, 3 or 4 rows down. Great, thanks. And just a reminder, if you just tell us who you are before your question.
Sure. Hi, my name is Alexia. I'm from Claris Law. Thank you for the panel. One of the first things I thought of when I saw the title of this conference was virtual reality. And it's got such a huge potential for very powerful and very immersive speech. So granted, we're not yet at a point where it's easily accessible to everyone, but I think we're getting much closer. So I guess my question's in 3 parts. It's 1, is this something you've thought about in the context of journalism? 2, if so, do you see a potential for it? And 3, any kind of legal issues that you think we're going to see more of if it does become more mainstream in the context of journalism?
We've actually done a report on virtual reality in journalism. We did it a couple of years ago at the Tower Centre. So we do think about it a lot, and I think, so I'd be interested in what the panel think about this as well. You're absolutely right that when we talk about sort of fake news, we're entering an era where you can have entirely fake kind of everything. And there are places like Microsoft Labs where they're doing something called synthetic reality, which is kind of like step beyond. We have Mark Zuckerberg talking about how great augmented reality is and how rubbing out that line between what's kind of real and not real is a great thing, and how it can make people sort of empathize with stories. But there's, you know, from a journalistic point of view, it's a microcosm of this problem of great opportunities, but also really sort of significant challenges if what you're trying to do is give people a real sense of the world.
Yeah, we have experimented with it a bit, just so we understand how it works, what it does. I think one of the there's a couple big challenges to the use of virtual reality in a journalistic setting. One is it's expensive. You know, it takes a lot to roll out the work, so I'm not sure where and when it'll be most useful in that setting. The other is a subtler thing, but every journalist and certainly every editor has to think about this all the time with everything we do. You know, journalism is some kind of a marriage, some kind of a mashup between cerebral and emotional elements, and we all understand that purely cerebral journalism actually has a lot of trouble engaging, and purely emotional journalism is actually often unfair, wrong, overheated. And every form of journalism has a different value quotient. Radio is very intimate, kind of warm. It brings you in. You feel like you know the person, whether you ever heard of them or not. Text is a bit more cerebral, intellectual. Photographs are obviously much more emotional and potentially, can bring your empathy or fear or whatever emotion you'll have. Virtual reality heightens that decision tree 80 times. So it creates a really interesting challenge. It's neither good nor bad, but it's all how you use it. And I think once we get past the issue of for most places at this point, the cost of it doesn't marry up with any reasonable use. But at some point it will, at which point we'll all have to deal with this issue of how do we use it responsibly, if that's the right way to say it.
I'm hugely sceptical about anybody wanting to do anything for very long with a box on their head, apart from 12-year-old boys who are idiots, and I say that as a mother of a 12-year-old boy, yeah. But no, I get it, yes, yeah, sure, it's developing. We had, yeah, thanks.
Hi, so I wanted to get back to yelling about Facebook.
That's good. Could you tell us who you are?
Sorry.
So Facebook can track you.
Right. Alexandra Solomon, I'm a recent grad from SIPA. I studied media and human rights. So my question for you all is about a practice that's particularly disconcerting for me, is Facebook and Twitter's use of complying with government requests. I feel like that's something that's really undercovered. I worked extensively in Azerbaijan where everything is criminalized, whether it's online activism or the libel laws, et cetera. So this is a particularly scary area, I think, that just isn't addressed enough.
So Jill, that's a great one for you. I mean, it also begs the question, which is, actually, is it a good thing if Mark Zuckerberg says, actually, I am an editor-in-chief and I am going to start to express values of, protection or free speech or whatever? Is that?
Well, it might be a good thing in Azerbaijan if it's easier for people in Azerbaijan to access information. But then, of course, it's got Mark Zuckerberg creating some infrastructure where he actively exercises that authority. That also raises concerns. But I think the there's this whole critique by governments that are want to assert essentially want to assert sovereignty over the internet system. China's in the lead, and they feel that the whole global system of information sharing is an imposition imposed on them, and that certain U.S. values are baked in. And so they have been making a concerted push to redefine this infrastructure, and China's in the lead, certainly leading this push with support from countries like Russia, and building networks in international institutions to kind of reframe the kind of global information order. And the companies are in a tough place because. And this is not to let them off the hook in any way, but and certainly there's been a concerted critique of their failure to address within the systems that they've created kind of human rights values or kind of insert that into their decision-making process. But if you look at a company like Twitter trying to operate in Turkey right now, I was just in Brussels last week and a Turkish journalist came up to me and said, look, I just got this message that my account has been blocked, and I wrote to Twitter and they're like, you should pursue legal action with the government. And she's like, yeah, really, I'm going to get legal redress by pursuing, thank you, Twitter. But the problem with Twitter is their argument is, well, we just want to be up and running in a place like Turkey, because if we don't comply with with these kinds of legal orders, even if they're illegitimate and even if they don't support the rights that are guaranteed to all people, all Turkish citizens under international law, we're not going to be able to operate at all. So, and then the other piece of that I think is also very alarming, going back to Aryeh's point, which is that when, and there are certainly, you could certainly have qualms about the power that these companies exercise in terms of sort of controlling this global information infrastructure. But the fact that they were US-based and US companies made them more resistant to these kinds of pressures. But they also had a certain amount of support from US government institutions when there was pushback. And so it's not clear at all how committed it hasn't been tested yet, but there's no evidence that Trump administration is fully committed to this global system and will defend it. So that's another concern that we have.
And I think actually Joel touches on a point that applies not only to the big platform companies, but also basically to any multinational company. It's just particularly visible in the platform situation, which is if you're a news publisher and you acknowledge your role, if you're a distributor of any kind of content actually, you're always faced with this issue of, do you want to do business in that country under the rules of that country? Right. And there have been plenty of situations where news companies have refused to do business in those countries. I'm not saying that we've been all pure either. There have been plenty of times, there have been plenty of news companies that went into China because they felt like getting some access to the market in China was worth the trade-offs they had to make, and then other companies said no. I think it's a completely legitimate question to ask a Twitter or a Facebook, are you really so valuable in the world that it's just important for you to be there, or would you actually be serving better by not being there if you can't operate in a way that preserves certain basic rights? I think that's a fair question to be asking. It's also a fair question to be asking, oil companies and retail companies and anything, but it's a basic issue.
Good luck with that with oil companies, or indeed with Facebook. Yes.
Hi, I'm Raya. I'm short, so I'll stand. We talked a bit about Facebook and Twitter and Google, but I wanted to bring up BuzzFeed specifically. Just now when I was sitting, I got a text alert saying Ryan Seacrest got a new job. And I was just wondering how you responded to the cheapening, kind of the online journalism.
I think you're being ahistorical, with all due respect. Bad journalism has always existed from the very beginning, and I just, BuzzFeed has a business. Their business isn't really journalism; they're really closer to being an ad agency. But that whole thing of sort of relentlessly pumping out kind of silly things about entertainment and cats, versions of that have always been around for at least 100 years, and really more than 100 years in American journalism, just on different platforms with slightly different means. And just repeating myself a little bit, I think the problem is much less, I don't think it's that useful, especially from a First Amendment perspective, to frame it as, let's get rid of all the journalism we don't approve of, and instead think about what can we do to support the journalism we do approve of, which is endangered. So I just don't, I'm sorry, I don't stay up late at night worrying about BuzzFeed and Ryan Seacrest, because I just think that's always going to be there. And there's
by the way, I got that same alert from several other news organizations
earlier.
So not only was BuzzFeed cheap, they were late.
Yeah, I got it.
Total loser.
I believe I believe it's what Brett Stevens is going to be writing about on the.
Not exactly
Also, I want
sure
to
who
stand
Ryan
up for
Seacrest
BuzzFeed.
is,
BuzzFeed
but-
actually do great journalism. if it wasn't for BuzzFeed, actually the whole fake news and the operation of the insides of Facebook wouldn't have come to light at all, because Craig Silverman, who actually did a report for us at the Town Centre on this 2 or 3 years ago, he's been following that story, and BuzzFeed pushed it, and they do great journalism. So at least they're taking the money from Ryan Seacrest and spending it on something reasonable. I will not have BuzzFeed traduced from this title. I don't even want to work there. I'm way too old. Sorry, so there was another question, I think. Yeah, got it.
Hi, my name is Charlene Flick. I'm a journalism graduate. I'm a lawyer. And now I'm an entrepreneur in emerging technologies such as virtual reality. But my question doesn't relate to VR today. When I studied journalism years ago, I learned about the two-source rule in journalism. Verifiability and two independent sources. I'm wondering if it's dead today in modern journalism, and if you could speak to its role in furthering veracity and journalistic integrity. Thanks.
So this is sources, yeah.
Here's the thing. Journalism, as we all know, is not a licensed profession. It's not a profession like law is a profession. So many organizations, for example, NPR, have their own code of journalistic ethics. We, Columbia Journalism School, have our code of journalistic ethics. But these codes are enforceable within institutional structures. That's why institutions are so important. They are not enforceable systemically, particularly if you're a free speech devotee. So the easier part of the problem is to say, two-source rule is a little tight. There are some places where I think you need a three-source rule, et cetera. But these standards of verification of stories it's pretty doable to say that we can create standards and enforce them within work environments. What's incredibly hard is to say, we are going to make it impossible. Like if you want to go out, if you just leave this, say, I'm just feeling irresponsible, so I'm going to start an irresponsible news organization and get a web address and start publishing things that are just have one source instead of two sources. Nobody's going to stop you, and nobody really can stop you, and probably nobody should stop you.
You might get sued.
So yeah, you might get sued. But so that's kind of the heart of the problem. And we're getting to the end. This is maybe the only panel on the Upper West Side on journalism I've ever been to where nobody's mentioned Fox News. So let me correct that and just say Fox News. No, I mean, what I mean is...
Do they get Fox News here on the West Side?
Yeah, no.
They actually watch Little L's.
This is related to...
It is virtual reality.
It's not your question, but I just wanted to, make sure we didn't get through the whole conversation without it. So I would just say, usually somebody gets up and says, why can't you do something about Fox News? Or why can't we tell the Fox News audience that it's not really fair and balanced, and then they'll stop watching it. So that comes under the same heading. There's not that much you can do or maybe should do about Fox News and without running the risk of censorship.
There's a question there.
Thank you. My name is Nick Steinberg. I now work at Columbia, but previously was at Human Rights Watch and also the U.S. mission to the UN in the previous administration. And my question is, I think, mostly for Joel, but I'd love if others could weigh in. In the Bush years, there was kind of this sense that when George W. Bush would embrace human rights or advocate for whether it was free speech or other human rights issues abroad, that there was kind of a kiss of death, that it was a tainted endorsement, and in fact that it caused more trouble than it was worth for the good actors in said country abroad because of our own actions in the world. And my question for you, Joel, is how you think about constructively engaging this administration to be for good free speech principles abroad when we are violating them internally or not practicing what we preach. In other words, is it useful for the Trump administration to be prodding countries on improving their speech, or actually can it actually have a kind of a perverse effect where it's better that they do not speak out when you are inviting Duterte and Sisi and embracing all these autocrats?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's kind of why I asked Aryeh to provide sort of a historical overview of what it has meant historically for even from a kind of strategic perspective for the U.S. to have a foreign policy linked to support for human rights. But the kind of the gulf between the articulation of these principles and the exercise of practice of these principles, particularly in a domestic context, there's always been a gap, and that gap has always had a direct correlation between the amount of influence that the U.S. government has been able to exercise. I think each situation is case by case. I mean, there may be circumstances in which, and I'm speaking completely hypothetically, in which certainly in a behind-the-scenes context, in a completely transactional way, it might be beneficial for the Trump administration to raise a particular case. And you want to preserve the ability to do that. But more broadly, I think really what's at stake in the Trump administration is not the U.S. influence per se, which has been so degraded. I mean, it was degraded during the campaign when Trump was asked, what he thought about the killing of journalists in Russia, and his response was, well, we do plenty of killing too. And it's been degraded by the way that he's engaged with, some of the most autocratic, repressive leaders in the first 100 days. The invitation to Duterte is really a new low. But I think what's really at stake is something even more basic, which is the kind of global norms. And so that is something we can still fight to preserve. Because I do think that what's happening that's so destructive is you're seeing a normalization of this kind of, it's not just like, it's way beyond like a healthy antagonism. It is a country, and I'm going to agree with Nick that the actual consequences, we're not seeing a chilling effect in the United States. We're not seeing that, at least so far, from this kind of language that the Trump administration is employing. But we're seeing a degradation, I think, of this global norm.
And Nick's question is a little poignant because if I'm hearing you right, you're assuming they even want to have those conversations. I'm not so sure they do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Who knows? But I mean, again, what we're trying to preserve is the global norm, and we're trying to preserve some semblance of influence that we can use in very specific cases. I can't quite think of what they might be, but I think we want to have that option should it present itself.
Two questions down here, right next to each other.
Hi, Peter Stern from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. This is kind of a provocative question, but I was just thinking about it based on your answer to Nick, which is the United States is not the only sort of major power that has used human rights discourses or that kind of pressure strategically. I mean, during the Cold War, didn't Russia sort of support civil rights in some ways to, undermine the U.S. rhetorical commitment to freedom? And so I'm wondering whether it's possible that if we have sort of free expression or free speech restrictions in the U.S., that will empower other countries to promote these values in order to weaken the U.S.
Promote which values?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much of a stretch. These values are hard-won. They don't naturally exist. They don't appear in the first chapter of Genesis on the list of things God created. And so to say...
Madison.
Well, maybe so. But anyway, to say there might be a good effect from having less free speech, less free press in the United States because other countries would want to sort of one-up us is, I'm not willing to make that sacrifice, not that it's my choice. That's my instant reaction to what you're proposing. It's, they say in Emily's country, too clever by half.
They do say too clever by half, which is rarely one of the things that they mean when they say it, unlike how nice to hear from you. Question immediately behind you. Thanks, Peter.
Hi. Hi, Mario Tedeschini, lead the Offshore Journalism Project. I was particularly interested in Nick Lemann mentioning, comparing actually, some of the big players, platforms, etc., to the oil standards and the old monopolists. I was wondering, shouldn't we perhaps also begin to talk about in terms of antitrust? But the problem there is to define a new market, because it's not the news market, it's not the car market, it's the transportation market. Perhaps it's the data market we should begin to look at as the relevant market in terms of antitrust.
So a couple of quick points about this. Antitrust, you should be sorry you asked me this, because I've been actually learning a lot about antitrust for a completely other reason. Remember that when the progressive era dawned, very important figures in the progressive era, like Herbert Croly, Walter Lippmann, and Theodore Roosevelt, despite his current reputation, were anti-antitrust. Lippmann and Croly especially said, this is ridiculous. This is a bunch of sentimental agricultural people who want to go back to an earlier America, and they made fun of Justice Brandeis when he started banging the gong about this. And there isn't anything. Now, there's all these lawyers in the room who can jump up and correct me. The antitrust laws do not say bigness per se is a violation of antitrust law. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people think the antitrust laws prohibit bigness per se, but they don't. Now, that doesn't mean that if we decide bigness per se is a problem in this or any other area, the country can't pass new antitrust laws. I think the last significant antitrust act was Kefauver-Seller, 1950, if I got that right, which is a few years ago. So it's been a pretty dormant legal area, at least at the level of legislation being passed. So I'd love to have a new conversation about it, but it's not like, oh my God, we've always been against. We've always been for breaking up big companies, and we've abandoned that tradition.
I would also add, just as a journalist and from a journalist perspective, the way I see it is that right now we're still just leaving the phrase of breathless awe about these companies.
Yes, exactly.
And we don't even really, exactly our thinking is still pretty ill-formed. And we need a lot of good journalism, a lot of reporting, some good conversations about it. And then you as citizen can say to the Congress, we actually think something needs to be done or not. But right now, I think the thing we most need is, what are they actually doing? What do they actually do?
What are they actually doing? That's a great note to end on.
Great.
Because we can have a whole other conference about that another day. So I just want to thank the panelists very much indeed. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Emily. Okay. Good.